Got quite a few folks from all parts of Ohio. Thank you for joining us this evening. If you're just entering the room, we would like for you to type in the chat window and let us know where you're joining us from this evening. Chicago, thank you very much for joining us. And while folks are continuing to enter the room, I'm also going to pop up a poll question here for you guys that will appear on your screen. And we would like to know, have you visited the Ohio History Center? And I'll leave that up here for about 30 seconds, give folks a chance to get in the room, get settled. Give you about another 20 seconds to vote there. About 10 more seconds on that. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close that out. And it looks like the majority of you, but not all, have visited the Ohio History Center at some point. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing those results. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We are recording this evening's event, and we will share that link to the recording out sometime within the next week. It'll come in a follow-up email. During the event, if there's a question that you have, click that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We're going to save time for questions at the end of the event, but you can enter questions in at any point throughout the event. And then we're going to go ahead and keep the chat open just in case you guys have comments you want to share, or maybe there's a resource or whatnot that you'd like to add. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to my colleague, Michael Fouts.
Hey, thank you so much, Matt. And once again, if you have any questions, my name is Michael. Matt and I will be helping facilitate those questions later on. But before we go ahead and turn it over to get our program started tonight, I would like to say a special thanks to our strategic partners, the Greater Columbus Arts Council, and Ohio's 529 College Advantage. Thank you so much for being our partner tonight. I will go ahead and turn it back over to Matt for the next section.
So I think at this point, we can turn things over to our moderator this evening, Michael.
Great, thank you all. Appreciate it. I'm going to sort of get things started here. I believe Ben Garcia was going to do an intro. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yes.
So thanks so much, Michael. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for Thinking Outside the Box, the novel architecture of Byron Ireland's Ohio History Center. My name is Ben Garcia, and I'm honored to introduce tonight a passionate and colorful panel of experts to celebrate our iconic building for the next 90 minutes. Our moderator tonight is Michael Bongiorno. He is the managing principal and design director for the Columbus office of AECOM, a global architecture and design firm. Michael is a highly regarded design and community leader noted for his unique, community impacting, mission-driven approach to architecture. Michael authored the design of numerous award-winning projects, notably being named the Wall Street Journal's Best Architecture of 2015 for his design leadership of Columbus Museum of Art's Margaret M. Walter Wing expansion. Michael is joined this evening by Steve Litt, who holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and studied city planning at Cleveland State University. Steve is the Cleveland Plain Dealer's art and architecture critic. He is known as a thought leader, a resource for the education of young architects, a persistent voice for design quality, and a catalyst of Greater Cleveland's increased awareness of the importance of its built environment. Also joining us tonight is Jim Luckino, who is recognized as a leading forensic architect. Jim has owned a private firm, Archatas Incorporated, in the Columbus area since 1991. During the construction of the Ohio History Center, Jim served as the architect's on-site field representative. He oversaw and approved the daily construction activities and recorded the daily work of all trades in a graphic manner. He worked with the museum staff to accommodate the move from campus to the new facility and assisted in getting large exhibits into the building ahead of schedule, worked to complete the model shop ahead of schedule, to assist with the building, building the new exhibits and more. Also joining us tonight is KB Jones, Professor of Architecture at The Ohio State University, Knowlton School of Architecture. She earned a certificate in urban and regional planning from the University of Oslo, Norway, and a Master of Architecture degree from Yale University, and was honored with an Eero Saarinen Memorial Award, the Wendy Elizabeth Blanning Award, and an American Association of University Women Fellowship. Jones's research includes modern and contemporary Italian architecture. Her most recent book, released in May 2020, co-edited with Dr. Stephanie Palat, is the Routledge Companion to Italian Fascist Architecture, with over 30 contributing authors. And finally, we're joined tonight by Tom Jones, who is a retired structural engineer and former president of Lantz Jones in Nebraska, a highly respected structural engineering firm in Columbus. LJN designed the structures on some of Central Ohio's most iconic buildings. Tom was one of the lead structural engineers on the Ohio History Center program for Corda. In 1972, Tom co-founded Lantz and Jones, which became Lantz Jones in Nebraska, and now is SMBH. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I'll hand things over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you so much, Ben, and welcome everyone. Pretty excited to talk to you tonight about the Ohio History Center. This is particularly a building that I really fallen in love with over time, and one of those buildings that when I moved to Ohio, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is pretty cool. Like that Ohio has a building of this significance and interest. I'm also a pretty good friend of the History Center, and I helped them back when I was with a former firm to lead the master plan, the 2017 master plan for Ohio History Center. So my connections to this project and this organization run deep. For some of you who may not know a lot about the Ohio History Center's site, what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the sort of the concepts behind the design. And then we're going to move into the panel conversation, and we'll have some Q&A afterwards. So I want to get through this overview part so that we can move on to a really robust conversation with all my colleagues. But the way that the building is sited, it's off of I-71, obviously in 17th. And you can see here that the building is sort of triangular shaped, and there's a square block at the center. And there's a large parking lot at the front and a mounded area that's almost like a hill at the entrance to the building. When you look at this project and a lot of Brutalist architecture in general, there's a really strong geometric underpinning to it that tends to be very simple and formal. And in this case, what Mr. Ireland did with this project was very almost like a more classical ordering system where there's a high degree of symmetry to the geometry, which I find to be really interesting when you think about a number of Brutalist buildings that are not in that manner. So in the simplest way, I'm going to kind of walk you through what some of the simple formal operations are on the building. So effectively, it's the square that is that sort of large block that hovers in the sky that sits over a rectangular base. So it's pretty elemental. And then the sort of operation beyond that is that you take that triangle and you clip the corners. And in some cases, those corners can become openings into the building. And then the next level is taking that triangle and deforming its legs so that it creates a bit of a delta form. As you look at what that delta form means in the space, you can see that that's where the majority of the exhibitions are. And you'll see here something that Jim and Tom will talk about later, sort of cross-shaped or cruciform columns that hold up that layer above. The next layer up from that sort of subterranean layer is what is called the plaza level, and really is the lid on top of the museum portion below that is sort of hidden from view. Then that's fronted by the mound. And part of the beauty of this project is the procession by which you ascend into that upper level by the original intention of the project. As you step up further, you've got library and archives and a really large reading room that hovers above that. So that's kind of the sort of horizontal stacking the building. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was what's interesting about this project is what happens to it vertically. So imagine that you've got this pretty simple ground plane, and that as part of Mr. Ireland's work, he essentially lifted that ground plane up and he created an artificial hill or mound out of that. And you know, there are precedents in Ohio for that, some of which are native burial grounds, but actually quite a few, and I think Mr. Ireland referred to this as a hill rather than mound. A lot of this influence could have come from, for him, what are called geological drumlins that scattered that throughout Ohio that are a result of a glacial imprint and glacial tilt treatment. So taking it a step further from there, you know, Mr. Ireland then, he essentially cut a hole in that landform and then carved out the underside of it to create the museum spaces, which you see here. And so as you're looking into the space, you're looking up through into that upper level where that plaza is. The next operation beyond that is how Mr. Ireland then essentially took an elevated block. He elevated this large block of space to make it look like it was floating above all of what was below it. And this is what the impression of that is in the space. So you're looking down into the museum level, you're looking across into the opening to the exterior, and then above you is this large volume. And of course, you can't float buildings yet. So this building has to stand somehow. He came up with this idea of these very large, almost like tree trunks of columns that would take you down and poke through the bottom layer of the museum and land on bedrock. And so that's what supported the building. And I love this old photograph because it really shows you what the visual impact of that is. This is a construction photo, which is why great. You can see these sort of really tall columns here, the block of space here, the opening below beneath the two, and then this sort of artificial landscape that's created by lifting the ground plane. And programmatically speaking, the way that it stacks, so the building program is that the upper volume is a library and the lower volume is a museum. And what mediates the two of it is this plaza level, which is both indoor and outdoor. And what's interesting is that the analogy has been made that this is sort of a sandwich. And that was the diagram, the sort of simplest way to describe it as a sandwich condition. But what I really love about this project is that it's very processional in the sense that it's trying to control space and time. So as you approach the building, you have this sort of gentle rise up this, by the original conception, a gentle rise up this mound, up these sort of very elegant, sort of long treaded stairs. And then you end up in this space, which is sort of the entry and the reception level where you make a decision about what to do next. And that decision is either you can descend into history. So Mr. Ireland was thinking that, you know, he would want to immerse people in history and make them feel that they were part of that experience, as well as ascending then into the library, into this monument of knowledge that created. And here you see a building section through the entire thing, and it really gives you a sense of just how big that museum level is as an artificial landform, and how large that upper volume is. And what's really special about this upper volume, this upper block where the library and archives are, is like the hidden gem of the project, which is this incredible reading room. That this is an older photograph of it, but it gives you a really good sense of the quality of light that comes in it, the material, the richness of the material, and the lighting itself. So stacking everything up then sort of from the bottom up in 3 dimensions, you're really going to get the sense here as you look at it of what this sort of carved out space is under this you know, artificially created landform. And you can kind of see how it tapers here and tapers here. And what that experience of that space is, you know, when you think about those cross-shaped columns and the structural systems, this, you know, this idea of simple geometries that are cruciform and also overlapping triangles plays prominently into this, given the 45-degree angles of how they're arranged. Again, covering all that is this great lid of space that you ascend up to. And you can kind of get a good sense of that here where that pulls away from the ground plane and gives you a little bit of a peek into the lower level and a view out. These really strong vertical supports for the building coming out of that ground plane and from bedrock below. And then what's really incredible is this, and Jim and Tom will talk about this extensively, is this incredible structural system that supports everything above. You can really get a sense of it here, this really novel structural system that creates an incredible cantilever. And I'd be lying if I said this didn't influence the way I thought about the Columbus Museum of Art when I led the design of it back in mid-2000s. So finally, though, the ultimate part of it is really this upper volume that sort of hovers above all of it. And I don't know if many of you know this, but the exterior was clad in this Ohio based silo tile. Basically, it was an homage to the masonry silos that were peppered throughout Ohio. And so it was really kind of a great way to kind of tie it to Ohio. Beyond all the monumentality, which is great, all the heroism of the architecture and the structure, some of the things that I love about the building most are really the experiential qualities. And for me, I have a singular obsession with natural light. The way that Mr. Ireland kind of used texture and form and surfaces to really play with the quality of light in the space. And then on the exterior was really sort of sensitive to thinking about things compositionally. And just this photograph here, the richness of the materials of the weathered copper against the the silo block, and the concrete and the grass and the occasionally blue sky in Ohio is really quite compelling. And the level of attention to detail in areas like this are very sensitive. So while this building is large and heroic, Mr. Ireland is an incredibly sensitive designer. And I really want to kind of communicate that to folks. I mean, just like this photograph here is it's almost like a painting in a sense when you think about the composition of it, the quality of the metal, the door, the wood, the concrete, the carpeting, and all that, and how light plays across the day and the year. And so that sensitivity to detail is not to be missed in a building like this. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to two incredible guys that I've gotten to know really well, Jim Luckino and Tom Jones, who are critical to the evolution of this building construction. Jim and Tom, take it from here.
Where do you want us to go?
Just tell us, a little bit about your experience with Mr. Ireland, and a little bit about, your process in working through the building.
Well, as Mr. Bongiorno mentioned, I was the architect's field representative. And back when this building was built, the architect actually had some role to play in the construction. He was in charge of it to the extent that he made decisions on a day-to-day basis. I was privileged enough to earn Byron's confidence enough to allow me to do that. And the building wasn't an easy thing to do. There was over 200 people on the job at any given day. There were every trade you could think of, and I had the opportunity to work with all these folks and got to know them fairly well. The plaza deck area outside is over an acre of ground, above ground, obviously. And there's probably in excess of 1 million cubic yards of concrete that went into this building. And Tom will get into the post-tensioning system, which had enough post-tension cabling in this to stretch from New York to Dallas. And it was quite a feat. One of the biggest problems was pouring the concrete, dropping it into forms that were 20 foot high and as much as 80 to 100 feet long. I don't know, it was just a fascinating time for me as a returning veteran from Vietnam, and getting to work with a lot of really great craftsmen, people who took a lot of pride in their work, which somewhat seems to be a bygone era today. And this guy here on the left, for example, was an iron worker. And this guy would pick that item in his hand, weighs over 350 pounds. He would pick it up with one hand and climb up a ladder with it. He was a monster, and his brother was a little bit bigger than him. And in the center, there's a picture of the connectivity between post-tension cables. These had to be calculated through Jones and his folks. And it was my job to make sure that they got put together correctly and placed correctly before the concrete was placed. In the bottom picture there, you'll see a bunch of look like holes in the building. That's where the post-tension cables are pulled. And if you're in the museum, the photograph on the right is a picture of one of those post-tension cables that was designed to be left open so that somebody could get an understanding of what it looked like. So I'll leave it to Tom to start talking about the structural experiences and some of the importance of the building that are, well, they're significant to the building, but something that the outside person may not really appreciate. Tom?
Okay. I'll explain a little bit my position with the project. At the time, I was working with Corda and Associates, and one of my co-workers was Bill Lantz, and Bill and I later formed Lantz Jones in 1972, so we had worked together for quite a while. The structure is very unique in many ways. First of all, I don't know of any other structures in Ohio or anywhere really that were analyzed by photoelastic methods. This is really an experimental method that was used because computer programs and finite element analysis wasn't available at this time. The reason this had to be done was because the proportions of the members. In other words, the walls up above were the beams, but they were so deep as compared to their spans that normal laws of stress and strain just didn't apply. So they were analyzed. Bill did this. Bill analyzed them by photoelastic methods. And I remember looking at the pictures with him and both of us scratching our heads a little bit, but it seems to have worked. But post-tensioning was used to a very large degree in this building, not only in the upper walls and the floors of the upper part, but also in the large beams in the lower plaza level, which were large spans. The cruciform columns were the supports for the large spanning beams. The floor structure of the plaza, though, was really a precast concrete, which was would be a pre-stressed precast member.
Tom, would you like to talk a little bit about the some of the unique details, like this rounded door head that you had great stuff about?
Yes. One reason the photoelastic methods are used because they can analyze stress concentrations, and we tried to avoid stress concentrations by using these rounded corners on doors and large openings in the walls, because this reduces it as compared to a perfectly square corner. So photoelastic methods today are often used in machine parts and things to analyze these sharp corners and the stress concentrations that are caused by that. Michael earlier alluded to the foundations. The foundations were poured in place concrete caissons that were drilled to the limestone bedrock, and then they were filled. Well, by the time you got down to the bedrock, you were at the water table. So they had to use what's called a tremie, where you pour the concrete into a funnel-shaped device that has a ball in the bottom of it. And when you pull the ball out, and that lets the concrete slide in, but you've kept the water from running up into the funnel by using that method. Very heavy loads were assumed on the upper storage levels, where I understand they're still installing book racks and storage racks for materials. The photo on the right here shows an auditorium that was the only part of the plaza that really wasn't a precast section of the plaza level. But it's kind of a unique, interesting structure.
Jim, you had a good story about that lower right-hand photograph, the lower left-hand photograph.
Lower left?
Jim had a good story about it.
Oh, okay. Jim, what was your story?
Well, the upper left-hand photograph shows the intricate framing that was done. As Tom mentioned, this was not a precast nor post-tensioned structure. And there was a lot of geometry, a lot of precise measurements and stuff that went in to get these beams in place. And then when we got around to pouring it, there was only about 4 or 5 guys, and all of a sudden the concrete started to dry faster than they could get it in place. And then all hell broke loose, and everybody on the job, whether you was a cement guy or not, even myself, were called to duty, so to speak. And we had to hurry up and get everybody on there. This pour started about 8 o'clock in the morning and didn't finish till almost 8 o'clock at night. And everybody on the job that worked for the RW Settling Company was on that roof getting that concrete placed. At that time, pumping concrete was not a popular method, and the contractor had that option, but he chose not to do it, much to his issues when he found out about it. But quite honestly, it turned out magnificently. It was very difficult to be placing concrete and to be able to vibrate it so that it didn't tear up the forms, and at the same time consolidated the concrete so we didn't get a lot of honeycombing. And happily, there was little to no repair work after it was done. But here again, this only shows the top side. There was an intricate framework underneath it to support all of the forms. And it turned out really, really great, and very happy with the way it turned out.
Yes, I would bless the appearance of that structure because I've had experience with much simpler structures and lots of honeycombing in the result, but that was a beautiful finish on that, really.
Yeah.
Jim, do you want to, you guys have great stories about these columns here and then the space between them, and what the kind of courage, Peter Corda had about the performance of his building. You guys want to talk about that?
Once all of the cables were tensioned and grouted, then it was time to come in and take the support pieces out. And so there was a picture here. Well, I can't see it now. It's on the right. When we started to pull the supports out, everybody evacuated the building because the bet was it was going to collapse. And I don't know where the picture is, but right here in the center picture, there's a picture of myself and Peter standing there when the top blocks were knocked out. And he had enough confidence in himself that that building was not going to fall. In the picture on the far right, after each one of these blocks were pulled out, there was a guy with one of the surveyors on the job with a level, and I had to go in and take the rod, and we would measure to see if there was any deflection once those were pulled out. But what this picture doesn't show is about 50 to 60 guys standing out in the parking lot and making bets that it was going to fall. Well, much to their chagrin, it did not fall. And during the course of pulling these out, there was no more than 1/10 of an inch of any deflection anywhere in any of those supports. And those supports go clear through the deck, clear down into the lower level. And happily to say, nothing happened. No.
And then, Jim, you had some great stories about how everything in this building is custom made. You want to build on a little bit on that in a couple of minutes?
Yeah, if you'd like. Now, this building is termed as a brutalistic piece of architecture. And while that may be true, what folks don't really perceive is the amount of energy Byron put into the detailing of this building. I mean, seriously, a lot of effort went into expressing what he was trying to do with the concrete. Everything in this building, except the classrooms and maybe some of the offices, the walls are all concrete. They're all board formed concrete. And there are some masonry walls in the building. Tom briefly touched on the radius heads of the doors. Every one of those doors was specially built with a 3/8 reveal, which was one of Byron's, he didn't like the idea of the metal touching the concrete. So he created a reveal, and all of the door frames are designed to meet that radius and also to have the reveal. He went through great lengths in doing the concrete. If you take a look at the picture on the left, which is in the library, there's a different format in the concrete. All of the what they call wall ties that hold the forms together during pouring, none of them were filled. They were all left as holes to express the concrete. Forms on the bottom were, specially built with the radius concrete boards, and those were specially made for this job.
Thank you, Jim. So that was a great sort of overview of the experience and the history of you guys working on the building, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I wanted to give Steve Litt a chance to talk about the period of brutalism and what that means within the context of when this building was built. Steve?
Thank you, Michael. I have to say, I've been fascinated by this discussion with Jim and Tom, getting kind of the inside view of the making of the building. And want to suggest, Michael, that would be interesting to hear your thoughts about how this building affected your thinking about the Columbus Museum of Art expansion, which I really enjoyed seeing a few years ago. My task in just a few minutes is to give a little bit of the national and international context of the Brutalist movement. So I'm showing you a picture of the Yale Art and Architecture building designed by Paul Rudolph, finished in 1963, which is a real classic of the style. Brutalism was, we can go to the next picture. Brutalism is, there's broad agreement that the style was inspired by the architecture of Le Corbusier, the Franco-Swiss architect who, together with Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, and others, is considered really one of the, the leading giants of the first generation of modernist architects who promulgated this style in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. Brutalism is kind of an offshoot of the original version of modernism, which spreads around the world. And we have an example here. Actually, can we go back one second? I just want to say one thing about the first building considered as an example of this style is Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, an apartment building in Marseille, which, as you can see, is a massive molded concrete structure standing up on very dramatic concrete pylons with the structure cantilevering out from that, which is interesting to think about in the context of the building we're discussing tonight. And then the Chapel of Notre Dame du Haut in Ronchamp in France. Next, please. You can see how directly that style, the style of Le Corbusier, influenced the style of things like Boston City Hall in 1963, designed by Coleman, McKinnell, and Wood, who were obviously looking at precedents such as the La Tourette Monastery by Le Corbusier just a few years earlier. Next. It's often forgotten that brutalism, as we know it, was very influenced by a pair of British architects, the couple Peter and Alison Smithson, designers of buildings including Robin Hood Gardens here. It's interesting to note that the style is meant to have a certain honesty about it. Alison Smithson once said in one of her proposals, "It is our intention to have the structure of a building exposed entirely without interior finishes wherever practicable. The contractor should aim at a high standard of basic construction." And I was thinking of that quote as Jim Luckino was talking about the construction of our building here in Ohio. Next, please. It's a global movement. It's just incredible how quickly and rapidly it spans around the world. It's embraced by all kinds of different governments and organizations. Just a few examples here. The Hotel Adriatic 2 in Opatija, Croatia, 1971 by Branko Znidarec, architect. Top right is the Geisel Library in La Jolla, California, William Pereira and Associates, 1970. Bottom left is the Ho Chi Minh City Medicine and Pharmaceutical University in Vietnam. And bottom right, again, hearkening to our example here in Ohio, the Tribunal de Contas in Sao Paulo by the firm Aflalo y Gasparini, built between 1971 and 1976. I think we could have a whole discussion about cantilevered buildings raised up on columns. Next, please. Of course, the desire to be iconic and to make massive sculptural forms, very expressive architecture, is part of the brutalist ideal. This can result, though, in some unfortunate urbanism. I think many of these buildings are designed as object buildings. They do not work well at the street level. They kind of want to be, viewed as things unto themselves. So it's hard to think of a brutalist urban environment that works really well. This is shots of the Erie View district in Cleveland, built between the 60s and 80s with some unfortunate design that looks very harsh and defensive and the kind of thing we don't like to see today. But we shouldn't forget that the issue with brutalism is how you distinguish between the really high quality examples that deserve to be preserved, such as the Cleveland Trust Tower by Marcel Breuer, which was actually under threat in the early 2000s. Cuyahoga County commissioners actually thought of replacing it with this rather mundane Cohn-Pedersen-Fox glass building lower left. And I wanted to share also the unfinished plan for the Breuer Tower, which would have had a second building on the left side. That was a casualty of some bank mergers. Brutalism is under threat today. We started with Paul Rudolph and his Yale building. This is the Burroughs Welcome building in the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. I spoke to a reporter there yesterday, and he told me that panels have been removed from the exterior and asbestos mitigation is underway. So this will not be saved. It'll be a terrible loss. Next, please. Another issue for brutalism is that some buildings are not actually demolished, but they're sort of denatured. So this is the Tri-C Metro campus on the left, and in the right edge of that is a student center, which was renovated and really rehabbed by Bielowski, a Cleveland firm, in 2019. And I'm kind of have mixed feelings about taking a building like that down to its skeleton and putting facades of glass and metal panels around it. Just as a cautionary remark, this is something that can happen. I think we need to, as we look at brutalist buildings, we need to be mindful of the ones that should be preserved as they are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that overview. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my good friend, KB Jones, who is going to share a different kind of perspective, which I really appreciate on Mr. Ireland.
Thank you, Michael. And good evening, everybody. After so much rich information about the Ohio History Center and brutalist architecture, I'm tonight's palate cleanser. I'm going to offer an example of Byron Ireland's modern genius at the domestic scale. And I think this home adds to the evidence that this Columbus designer is underappreciated. The Smith House at 960, stay there, yeah. The Smith House at 960 Evening Street in Worthington was completely unfamiliar to me until I was invited to visit it last summer by the childhood friend of my friend, Ann Hamilton. Next slide, please. Laura Smith grew up in this house with her 3 siblings. She described as a kid, recognizing how unique it was to be able to live in this house with cold concrete floors and with no basement, no lawn to mow, and an outdoor room right in the middle of the house. The kids loved it. Now, the clients for the house, Elaine's mother and father, Elaine and David Smith, were Byron Ireland's clients at the same time that Ireland was working on the Ohio History Center. Dave Smith had studied architecture at Ohio State before he went on to Pratt, where he got his degree in industrial design. He worked abroad for a while, and then he came back to Columbus to begin the renowned design practice with his partner, Dean Richardson of Richardson Smith, which later became Fitch. And you can go to the next slide, Michael. And so Ireland was a visiting critic at Ohio State between the years of 1965 and 1968. And the Smiths began working with him. Now, Elaine Smith had been a high school classmate of Ireland's, and her father, Ralph Fallon, was the contractor that built this home. Elaine describes the three strong heads that were at work in this project, and knowing the intensity of Ireland's work, one can only imagine. I would love to have been a fly on the wall at some of those design meetings. Fallon, Alan's father, had built many monumental stone homes in Upper Arlington. He was not convinced by the flat roof of this house, but Ireland credits Fallon when he received the 1969 Ohio AIA Design Award for the dwelling. By all accounts, the family loved living in this house, and they lived there for 50 years. Next slide. Let's go back again. I just want to make one comment here in this courtyard building. Elaine told me today that when they met with Ireland, they had three choices. He had given them three sketch designs. They immediately picked the courtyard house. And when we look at this beautiful courtyard space, a kind of simple, elegant Japanese style, and imagine the fact of a family of 6 living in a 3,000 square foot house, you immediately understand, with all the spaces distributed at ground level, the role that the courtyard plays in evenly distributing the program to give a lot of flexibility, privacy, and so on to those domestic spaces. Next slide, please. Now, I found it interesting to become aware that Byron Ireland, prior to coming to Columbus and locating his practice here, had worked for Aaro Saarinen. Aaro Saarinen was the architect, along with Dan Kiley and Sandra Gerard, of the home for J. Irwin and Xenia Miller in Columbus, Indiana. There are many dissimilarities between the two projects, but I want to call out some of the things that I find uncannily similar. First of all, the distribution to the 4 corners of the main program elements of the domestic program with this centerpiece. In the case of the Miller House, the center is actually covered. It's where the social programming is located. Next slide, please. And as we can see from outside, this enclosed centerpiece that gives a social center to the house is also the location of the sunken living room. Next slide, please. And this sunken living room, we're told, is really the first example of what becomes a kind of modern icon in highly progressive domestic spaces. And here we are inside Miller's home. But I want to look at some of the similarities between the idea that Ireland built in a relatively modest but very elegant domestic home, where we find things like this, where the axial views, aligned doors, the choreography of lighting really make dynamic space out of even corridors, every space of the building. Next, please. And that internally focused organization of the courtyard maximizes privacy to all the domestic activities that are situated around. It's really a kind of a brilliant idea. Next, please. So while these houses have very different ideas about landscape and nature, both are total works of art, and they're isolated from the neighborhood contexts around them to sublime effect. Neither house has a traditional facade. Entry is a discovery. There is no grand formal entrance, very different than what is probably the ideal of the dwelling prior to this modern period. And next, please. And I think we can see with both the Miller House and the Smith House that structure is an experimental and aesthetic element that gives great quality to the house. It's the source of light, and it elevates the spirit from the spaces within. The Smith House is now my very favorite house in Columbus. I find it to be something that's not only gives some real dimension to the work of Byron Ireland, but is really quite a kind of classic work of the modern spirit in domestic form. And so in conclusion, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to Elaine and Laura Smith, who I think are with us watching tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, KB. And at this time, we are going to get into the panel discussion part of things. So I'm going to have my panelists all get on the screen and join me here. And I'm going to start asking them some questions, and maybe they'll ask me questions too. And then after that, we will open it up to the audience questions. So welcome back onto the screen, everyone. KB, since you left off, and one of the things that struck me about what you said was about the experimentalism with structure and how pronounced it was as part of the experience of the building as an experience. And I think about the History Center and that very expressionism, and I think I would ask Steve this question too, could be that sort of level of assertiveness of architecture in a museum building could be a challenge to curators. And so I'm curious, like, where you guys fall on the balancing act between the two, because obviously this building is going to be adapted over time. You'll have to accept different kinds of exhibitions. Talking to Jim early on, the original conception of that exhibition space was to be the thing that it would be for a long time. But as time is, and exhibitions have changed it, you've had to figure out how to adapt. So how do you encounter assertive architecture with something as specific as museum exhibitions and do it well?
Well, there's a classic example of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which has the spiral ramp, which curators are constantly frustrated about. I can also toss in my experience of the Guggenheim Bilbao, which has a real contrast between the rectilinear galleries that are really ideal places for looking at two-dimensional art, and these spectacular sculptural spaces, which are challenging to curators. Mm-hmm. So to me, the best museum architecture always thinks about the object first. I could say an example that I found unsuccessful in that regard is the Denver Art Museum by Daniel Liebeskind, with these walls that just make it very difficult to understand what he's trying to achieve in terms of space, and which seems to conflict with the art. I haven't experienced the Ohio History Center, so I can't speak firsthand about that, but it looks to me like an open, flexible space that would require some additional modification for different kinds of displays, but the other speakers would know more about that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things about the museum originally was it was intended to be an educational experience, not just a visual. And, that is gone. And I jokingly told Mr. Bongiorno that if Byron could see it today, he'd probably roll over in his grave, because it was his intent to leave everything on the ground floor to be wide open so that you could look out and get your attention to the natural history area or the Native American area. And you could wander around, and there were exhibits that exhibited the past, if you will. There was an educational area where there was an auditorium where you could go in and there would be lectures on natural history, and biology. There was big on the mastodon, which was a huge attraction. So a lot of that has gone by the wayside, and it's unfortunate, but as you say, time marches on, and so do change. So one thing about the space, it's big enough that you can do almost anything you want in it.
Thank you for that, Jim. It made me think, this conversation we're having about, the appropriateness of space for the use. One of the things that always sort of gnawed at me as I looked at this building, and I adore it, is the sandwich right? Is the stacking of it right? Should it be library in the air that's in a blank box and museum sort of subterraneously? And I was always sort of curious about if other people had that thought that that museum experience in an upper level box could have actually been somewhat engaging in a different way, especially when you consider the courtyard that's created around the center, that sort of light well. I'm curious if anybody else has ever thought about that, in terms of
misunderstanding. I think the library term is probably a misnomer.
okay.
The library contains a lot of historical books, somewhat like the Library of Congress. It's not open to the public, and you have to be doing a lot of research in order to go up there. And if you're a researcher, then that plays into the educational part. But the general public, at least when we finished this thing, did not have access to the library area. And there was a lot of criticism because there weren't any windows in the offices. Well, Byron's attitude was, you don't need to look outside. You're supposed to be in there working. And the only reason he put in a couple of windows was to give somebody an idea whether it was raining or snowing. But if you wander through that area, there's no light in that area except the reading room. And back in the day when this thing started, you had to have permission from the president to get up there, because once they started moving the books in, you were not allowed to go up above that level. But at the same point in time, he made the bottom areas accessible to everybody for whatever purpose.
It's interesting to draw attention to the similarities between our own Wexner Center and the Ohio History Center, both in the sense, Mike, when you introduced initially your interest in the procession, that one rises up to enter, but then goes down to enter the museum. The same thing happens at the Wexner. And one of the things that I found quite strange when the Wexner Center first opened is that from the office spaces, there are no views out. Only one person had a view from the office level, and that was the director of the museum. So maybe we haven't learned quite as much as we should have in the process. But I want to go back to your earlier question, Mike, because I think it's an important modern question that has become a postmodern question. That is, what is the ideal museum when the building is in service to its contents, when we're really trying to make something that's meant to contain, to archive, to show off, to frame, and to exhibit something else. And of course, the battle that came about, starting from the Guggenheim, ultimately elevated to the level of buildings where the building is the art, or the artists complain that the building is so dominant that it has no place for their art. And that led to a splinter movement like, the Nabisco factory and Mass Mocha and the warehouse buildings that get turned into major rehabbed facilities. And artists like Robert Irwin and James Turrell love and prefer to exhibit there. Oftentimes you can hear Anne Hamilton say she would prefer to exhibit her work in a library rather than an art museum, or in deference sometimes to a museum that's so certain of its own self-satisfaction in a way. So I think the question of exhibition and the question of the architecture is one that's going to continue to stimulate us in many ways. But I recall the fact that when the Wexner Center opened, as powerful and strong a physical form as it was, it also stimulated a series of artists who had to react against the building, and their work became a response to the physical form itself. And that's continued in some of the most interesting things we've had. Now, that's when a creative artist can make work specifically in relationship to that architecture. That's different than saying we've got a mastodon skeleton, or we've got this great, these historic findings that deserve to have maybe a more neutral space. But you touched earlier on one of the most important materials of design, and that is lighting. And I think in brutalist architecture, one of the challenges we face, especially having studied in Paul Rudolph's building at Yale, is the quality of light that we get when we're surrounded exclusively by concrete. You almost can't get enough warm daylight in that space to make it habitable.
I was heavily involved not only in the design, but actually the construction of the Wexner Center. And it had a lot of flaws because about 5 years after it opened, I went back and had to do a lot of repairs to the building. But there were two different thought processes. Byron's process was open to the public, education. Dick Trott's attitude was a little different, because if you take a look at the research people, they're all underground. Almost every one of them is buried underground under what was used to be a parking lot. But the museum there was not to be so much educational as it was to be an exhibit, a space, right, which was, it was driven by a lot of different things. I had the privilege of working on that one as well and going back and making a lot of repairs to it 5 or 6 years later. And I also worked on the Boston City Hall. So I've been through 3 major buildings that have been a very big experience for me.
Jim, you will remember that I was the engineer of record for the Wexner Center. And I would comment, though, that the cartoon museum or library or whatever you want to call it was certainly an afterthought. The money just rolled in to fund it unexpectedly. And
it's underground.
and we had to find a place to put it. So, I mean, that's where it went.
Yeah.
Tom, I'd like to hear from your perspective, sort of bringing things, sort of getting our hands dirty a little bit here and bringing things down to the ground. This building is so much about the structure. It is the most apparent component of it, as it is in many brutalist buildings. And what you described a lot of the systems, which were all incredibly innovative in a lot of ways in the way that you handle them. But what do you think in terms of moving from that to the construction? What was the biggest challenge for you all as an engineering team as you try to figure out how to make this entire thing work as elegantly as it has?
Well, at a meeting, Peter and Byron worked on a piece of bumwad sketch paper and came up with a design of the building. And Peter brought that back to the office, and that was what it was going to be. I mean, there was no question that this couldn't be done or that something had to be altered. That original sketch was taped on his wall for quite a few years. And it looks just like the building ended up looking. I think one advantage we had was the contractor. The Setterlands were very open to innovation, and the project was originally bid and was over budget, and it had to be reduced in scope in some way. And for example, there was a escalator in the lobby instead of the grand staircase, and that was taken out. But frankly, I think the grand staircase is a much more elegant solution than the escalator ever was. Yeah. But Setterland should be complimented for the ability to make the project work. They really wanted it to work.
And sort of coming off of that, Jim, you've shared a lot of stories about, some of the things that you struggled with on the project over time, and they're really great stories. I was wondering, if you could maybe highlight maybe one of or a few of the biggest challenges, but also there's some really funny stories that you have about the building and Byron as well that I think people would really appreciate hearing, because behind all the architecture is a human, and it's good to get to know that kind of person.
Well, I guess one of the funniest things was for me was I was on the site one day, and my immediate boss was a guy by the name of Gene Schramm, and we were walking through the ground floor, and there was a mechanic, who's a plumber, and he was trying to get a piece of pipe in a wall, and Gene heard this guy ranting and raving and using some expletives that even me in the military I never heard, and Gene walks over to this guy and he goes, "Who was the blank architect that drew this damn thing?" He says, "No well hell this was going to work." Well, you'd have to know Gene. He looks down at him and he says, "Look, if I can draw it on the wall, you damn sure better be able to put it in the wall." And Gene walks off. It was just an amazing response, and he never cracked a smile. There were a lot of instances where we had conflicts where the actual workers just couldn't understand what the hell this thing was going to look like. And it took hand holding and a few beers after work, but it was a team effort by all the guys. I mean, all the trades drank together, they all ate together, they all played jokes on each other. We had a guy working there who was barely 5'2", and we called him Bump Beep Beep. And he'd got his brain scrambled as a boxer. And his chore was to move materials around. Well, one day he had a stack of plywood to pick up and move from one side of the building to the next. Well, the next thing you know, he's got a piece of plywood strapped on his back. He goes walking around the building, and that building sits in the middle of nowhere. A big gust of wind came up, and he was about 10 feet off the ground, and he would not let go of that plywood. And everybody's hollering at him to let go. So he finally decides to let go, fell about 10 feet, and plywood was right on top of him. But every day had something comical happen. I'm happy to tell you that nobody got seriously hurt on that job, and no one was killed, which is an amazement because of working on that thing. The post-tension cables exploded on a couple of instances, did a lot of damage, and with 5,000 and 6,000 pounds of pressure on them cables, when one of them broke loose, you better not be in front of it. But one of the things, in Tom's credit and Peter's, this was kind of an experiment, as he said, in post-tensioning. And I think over my years since that, I've seen a lot more buildings being done post-tensioning. And I think the research and the efforts that Tom and Lantz Jones, Lantz did, as well as Peter, started a new era for the use of post-tension cabling. This building is a phenomenal building when it comes to structure. Set that aside for its intended purpose as a museum. But I could talk for years.
Jim, I'll throw in another comment about this. Peter was very innovative and always looking for interesting ways to do things. We did a building out at St. Mary's of the Springs that was called a lift slab, and that was post-tension. But all the slabs, it was maybe an 8-9 story building, all the slabs were poured on the ground, post-tension, and then they were jacked up into place. They were raised on steel columns. So that was another very interesting building. I got a lot of interesting experience working for Peter.
Yeah, but you know, both Peter and Byron were visionaries. I really think they were. And you know, there's several buildings here in Columbus that we haven't even touched that Peter did. And, or I'm sorry, that Byron did. There's a church up on Carl Road that mimics some of the details KB talked about in the Smith House. And I was a part of that building, and it's really a neat looking church, but we lose track of that. We also did a lot of residential buildings, and they were by no means brutalistic, but they were very period oriented, like very, you know, like what I want to say, like colonial buildings. And I can't tell you, I was blessed to have that experience working with him.
The Golden Bear Shopping Center on Riverside Drive is also an Ireland building.
You know, Jim, you mentioned, you know, brutalistic buildings, and you know, I want to step back for a moment because I have great adoration for this building, as do a number of you. But brutalist architecture, you know, can be polarizing in terms of preference, right? Some people like it, some people hate it. And I'm curious. I mean, I wouldn't say that this building falls purely in the sort of brutalist ilk. There is something, I think, a little more. There's a little more granularity to it in terms of nuance that you know, possibly isn't in some of the, you know, purely all concrete buildings. So you know, maybe KB and Steve, I'd want to, you know, hear from you guys. You know, why do you think brutalist architecture is so polarizing as a style, and you know, how can we, because we don't want, these are now artifacts now, we don't want to lose them. And Steve, you had mentioned buildings that are at risk. And so how do we help people to understand the value of them?
Well, I think, you know, one has to distinguish between the really great ones and the ones that are, you know, poor imitations, poor, you know, expressions of the style. But the reason why people don't like it is because so much urbanism today is about the street, and many of these buildings are really not about shaping urban environments. They're standalone objects, which was a central idea in the modernist movement, that the building would stand apart and you'd appreciate it as a kind of an abstract object, a sculpture in the landscape. This building is certainly fits that description, but it's such a powerful and heroic expression of its function, and poses so many interesting issues that we've been discussing tonight, both functional, formal, and structural. So another factor I would say in terms of how people react to brutalism is that depending on how it's fabricated and how the structure, how the construction is carried out, some of these buildings are not aging well. So it's depressing to people when they see older buildings in this style with giant chips of concrete peeling off, spalling off, and moisture gets into the underlying, whether it's rebar that stiffens the structure or post-tension cables or what have you, and you see trails of rust coming down the facades. That's just a downer. People, whether they understand what's happening to the building or not, whether they think it's structurally significant, it's just depressing to people to see that, and they want to see something new. Americans love what's new in the landscape. These buildings are reaching that kind of witching hour in architecture 50 to 75 years after they were built, when serious long-term maintenance issues are coming forward, and we have to decide, communities have to decide whether or not they're going to be preserved or adaptively reused, which is another issue that I wanted to bring forward in terms of defacading a building and giving it an entirely new character.
One thing you'll have to find out that the museum does not exhibit a lot of rusting steel and all that other stuff. And when you get into this urbanism issue, there was a guy that worked in Byron's office, and some of you may know him. His name is Jerry Horn. And Jerry Horn was one of the premier landscape architects, and I can remember him spending hours and hours picking out and developing how this building sat on that site. He and another architect in the office, Dick Bassler, worked diligently to put this thing together. And so there was Byron had his role, but he delegated other portions of his role to those we've had a lot of confidence in, and Jerry Horn was one of them. And Jerry went on to be a very well-known landscape architect in the Columbus area. And the whole team in the office had a part in it one way or another, because Byron was not by himself. He allowed us to express our opinions. He didn't have to pay attention to them. And sometimes we got told what we could do with our opinions, but at least he listened to them.
Stephen makes a really important point about the urban, the lack of good quality of urban space that is oftentimes characteristic of brutalist monumental buildings. But of course, that's not a characteristic that's unique to brutalist modernism. Many modern works of architecture similarly failed to design a good street or create a good ensemble of related urban spaces. And because culture is changing, moving away from the car, we want to have great streets again, we're starting to be more critical of that aspect. One of our attendees today, Fred Smith, makes an important point, which is the fact that the term brutalism comes from the French term béton brut, which simply means raw concrete. But the fact that the term brutalism, as we've appropriated, as it's become a term in the English description of a style of architecture, is not detached really from the fact that people find something tough and mean and hard and brutal about the architecture. So although the original term deserves recollection, the way the term has come into our meaning is related to the experiences many people have had in the work. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. I think just the sheer quantity of exposed concrete does not make great spaces for most activities, for most things. And so where we find buildings with the subtlety of design of this building, of the Ohio History Center, is really, really important, because the more we appreciate all the things people have presented tonight, the high quality craft, the section design of the building, which makes a much more interesting and in many ways more humanized set of spaces, because you get a variety of spaces. You get big things and small things. Obviously, the Ohio History Center is not meant to be an urban building. It's meant to command a landscape all by itself. most of the buildings by Le Corbusier were similar. They weren't aiming to make an addition to the city. They were wiping out the city. But in doing so, they made great landscapes as well. So I think we're faced with the fact that great architecture and great design is enhanced by collaboration between urbanists, urban designers, landscape architects, and modern architects. And we have enough examples of them in the history of modern architecture, citing again Daaro Saarinen, to remember that the more we can elevate those great examples, the more we can appreciate, and hopefully, as Stephen's calling for, restore and keep intact those works that represent the past. Our profession needs to continue to develop those who appreciate the history of architecture to be able to communicate that.
Maybe one of the problems we're having here with this discussion is if we could go back in time and understand the marriage between this building and its surroundings, a lot of the stuff that was planned originally, we keep looking at this view, we don't show the Velma Avenue entry, which was a public space, but how the village got developed. Yeah. And how that was supposed to have a link back into the building. That stuff never happened. And in a way, it kind of detracted from what the building was supposed to be, the center point. And obviously, if you're familiar with the site, if you go beyond Velma Avenue, it's nothing but parking lots for the fair. But the connection between the building on the north side, to the village was never fully developed. There was supposed to be a big pond out there. They were supposed to bring in a historic covered bridge that never happened. And there were some railroad issues that were supposed to be there. Again, the whole theme was educational and it just never developed.
I'm curious about that, Jim. You mentioned that, it was supposed to relate to a broader context. What all else? So you mentioned the connection to the village, but were there other facilities that were intended to be planned nearby in addition to the village?
No, everything went to expand to the village area, because on the south end, we had to deal with the Highway Patrol Academy. And on the west, you just had Velma Avenue, and heck, that was just a dirt road when I was a kid. And those were just where you went to the fair. So there were some buildings that were intended to happen on the fairgrounds. A lot of them did, some of them, I guess, did not. But if you could have seen the original works of Jerry and Peter and I'm sorry, Byron, that how you walked from the building to the village. But now when you go out there, they're like two separate, attractions. They're not married like they were supposed to be. And that kind of lost its way somewhere along the line. I don't know where. But
one more question before I'm going to turn it over to audience questions, because we're at that time. This has been an incredible conversation. But following up on what you just said and what we just talked about, was this building ever imagined to be like added to? Where would you put an addition on this building?
You wouldn't.
Yeah.
No, it was the hub of whatever went around it. But obviously to the east, the hub is the parking lot. To the south is the Highway Patrol. So all the expansion was supposed to go to the north along Velma Avenue. And the village was not a part of our work. And it was not initially in it. I don't think it got built for 2 or 3 years after the museum opened. But originally, if you went there, the idea was that you could go walk up on that 1 acre chunk of grass and have a picnic. There was food services in the plaza level at one point in time. There was a lot of changes to this building over the years that I get creepy when I go back in there, because I don't see all the flags that used to fly in the center. They're all gone. The airplane, all gone. There was a lot of interesting things that it was geared up for children and to learn about Ohio's history. The President's Wall is gone. How many people know how many presidents there were from Ohio?
8.
But they were all displayed on the plaza level, or when you came down the grand staircase. That was a big deal. There was a story about every one of them. Take up too much time. Let's go to the for those out
Yeah,
there.
no, thank you so much for that, Jim. And obviously, we want to hear from you because you have so much relation to this building. And KB, I appreciate the eloquence of how you ended things there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Fouts and Matt, and they're going to entertain some questions.
Hey, thank you so much, Michael. And thank you for all of our panelists for such an amazing program tonight. We are going to go ahead then and switch over to the audience question portion of the program. And Michael, what I was thinking about doing is I'll say the questions as they come out loud, and then you'll continue to facilitate the discussion between our panelists, if that sounds good.
Okay.
So for this first question from Philip, and everyone was kind of hinting and already addressing this question, but I think to reinforce this, what are the limitations of this type of architecture? For instance, it seems that despite some additional land being available on the site, the style prohibits expansion as OHC holdings grow.
So the question is probably similar to what was just asked, which is, if you were compelled to, if you had to, how would you add to this building in some way that is meaningful and it respects what it is? And how does a building of this type, limit either through the structure or its, its sort of iconic nature? How does it limit that? Anybody want to field that one?
Well, I'll throw this out as an engineer. To me, the building is a work of art. I mean, it's a piece of art, and any piece of art you would have in your own home, you wouldn't add to it or anything like of the sort. So, I mean, I don't see how the building could ever be added on to. It would have to be something distinctly separate on the site.
I'll take a different position. I think we have to be open to the fact that our buildings are as beautiful and as important as they are to inspire awe and record our culture. They also have to serve us and our needs change. Our culture is elastic and flexible and is changing all the time. So I would think a great building that's a great history center should and can also continue to evolve. I wouldn't do anything to compete with the floating box, which I think is one of the most elegant things in Columbus. But I actually think the section diagrams that Mike showed us at the beginning offer lots of opportunities for expansion and evolution. So I think the plinth or the base, that triangular shape isn't sacred, that many things could be done to expand from the base, potentially add additional icons that float over the ground, or depending on what the program is, depending on what we need more of. I think there are a lot of ways that this building, unlike a lot of buildings that are so final, could be able to expand by dealing with that under level, that lower level, and not take away anything from the integrity of the building.
I would just like to add that I think there's a lot of space on that site for parking, and that perhaps creating a family of objects related to one another on that site, and then perhaps on the line of this central axial view that we're looking at right now in this photograph would be another possibility if one did consider the lower plinth of the building to be sacred.
Stephen, just imagine the real estate if we had public transportation that could get people to the site without having to come in a private car.
Well,
right. You'd want to, how would you get people in and out? What would that look like? How it would be different? How would transit affect the experience of procession into the building? All interesting questions to consider, but I wouldn't consider it an unexpandable place or site. We would just have to look at the land that's there. But I do agree that the floating box, you'd never want to touch that.
I can tell that KB is a urban planner to some degree by her comments, but when this thing was built, there was a stop on the Velma side where children could be brought into the building from the Velma Avenue entrance. They were taken into the auditorium and they were given a grand tour of the whole place. So it was set up for that issue. The parking lot, obviously the parking lot is a huge area, but that wasn't serving just the museum. That was parking for the fair. So you have to take into account that drove a lot of that site. It wasn't meant to be that big. And, powers being what they were at a point in time, the whole parking lot was about half that size originally. And then when we got to paving it, the whole thing went, and it was geared up for the fair. And So again, I would probably have a fit if somebody ever tried to modify that building, and trying to modify it from the ground level, you don't know what you're getting into, because there's a lot of junk underneath that building, and it would not be a very efficient use of the space. And then trying to tie it into the architecture of the radius walls that go around it, that would be a very difficult task. I would just hope in my lifetime that nobody messes with it. I'm getting close to the end, so you won't have to worry about it much longer.
You know, it's interesting when you talk about the lower level. I've read on a number of occasions in reading about the building, and these were in Ireland's word, that he referred to that as the non-building part of the building. And this idea of an unbuilding or non-building is kind of intriguing if you think about, how you would expand a facility like this. And maybe it's more of an extension of that implied ground plane rather than, discrete objects. So I think that story is yet to be told in a way, but it's fun to imagine, what ifs, because in the end, the life of a building has to change and evolve, and the culture within which it sits. And what you don't want to happen is that the building goes away because there's a perception that it is not pliable over time. So I appreciate that question.
I have a follow-up to this question of the adaptability of the building. Can anyone speak to how it performs in terms of the ADA?
I was
very well, as a matter of fact, because there's a ramp on the north and the south. Originally, those two ramps were designed for egress for emergency vehicles. They are still, if they haven't changed them, they're still available if somebody had to drive a vehicle up there. The elevators will take you to any floor. And when you're on the lower level, it's all one level. So with the changes in how you enter the building now, you have on the left-hand side of the ramp, they've changed the entry into the building at that point, because now you got to pay, but that's handicap accessible. There may be some issues with some of the bathrooms, but I don't know that. But the building is accessible.
Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting point about accessibility, though, because if you look and you consider, what the original processional experience, Steve, I think is where, that's why I pulled up this photograph. I think is where the challenge of preserving that initial experience of this sort of, very elegant processional rise up the building. But as Jim mentioned, the entrance currently is here. So, this was the original. So in terms of accessibility, you're creating a condition that is off of the original concept to bring people into a more friendly way to kind of move vertically. So, the question of, can this ever be resolved to accommodate that, I guess, is one of the questions that I think is out there, for the long term. Other audience questions?
Yeah, Michael. So the next question comes from Tom. What was the climate, or who were the people at the time, either at the Ohio Historical Society as it was at the time, / Ohio History Connection as it is today, or at the state of Ohio, that allowed or enabled Byron Ireland and his associates to design and execute a building and site with such a high level of attention to design and detail?
Yeah, this is actually a great question. And, I want to say something about it before I pass it off to the rest of the group. It wasn't, think about it. This building was sort of being designed to construction, and I think was a pretty dark period of the country overall, 68 to 70. We had a lot of, social unrest. But this building in some ways feels very hopeful in what its aspirations are. So I want to kind of like frame it with that regard, that it took a lot of courage to basically convince what historically would have been a fairly conservative state in terms of architecture to do something like this. So with that question from Tom in mind, Jim, do you want to address, because you were there, you were around for the conversations that were happening at that time with Rhodes as the governor and all those folks that were kind of weighing in on how to make a building like this happen, and could it even happen today?
Well, I don't know about whether it could happen today or not. Obviously, there was a little political involvement with this, with the governor, and this was a pet project of his, as I understand it. I had no involvement in that, but the building employed a lot of people and used up a lot of Ohio products and materials, so it had a big impact on Ohio's economy. And during the course of the project, Ohio State would bring over students. Byron would walk them through the building and explain why he did this and why that was doing what it was. It's like when you take a look at the oval out in the front, the intent there was to get you to have to walk up those steps. I don't care who you are, you ain't going to walk up them steps in one fell swoop. But the object is, as you walk up them, you get to perceive this building from different viewpoints. And then when you get to the top and you go across that ramp, it's pretty breathtaking. So it was a statement, there's no question about it. And I don't recall anybody having any adverse reactions to this building when it was being built.
Who was the real champion for it from either the History Center or the state? Do you know that?
Well,
remind me,
at the time I was involved, the director was a gentleman by the name of Charles Pratt. He was the director of the museum. And you had another individual, a Dr. Bobby, who was an archaeologist. And he had a lot of input into how this thing went together because that was his baby. And so each of the departments, surprisingly enough, all had an equal share in the space for their exhibits. And they all worked really well together, because I had to meet with these folks when we did the exhibits themselves. And I don't know the political side of this, whether this could be built today or not, who knows? You need to find somebody to sponsor it, but we can build stadiums that house a lot of people. I don't know that they do as much good as what this museum does, but that's a personal issue. So there was a lot of interaction between the museum staff who were all housed at Ohio State and what went on to the internal planning of this building. I think everybody was really accepting it because it was a bigger space. They were able to have their own little fiefdom to do whatever they wanted in those spaces. And if you go just north of this bridge into the building, that whole area all the way down was the shop where all these exhibits were built. And they had a really great shop, a wood shop. They made trains, made tracks. So I don't know that there was any adverse reactions to this building at the time. I can't recall any negative press that went on at this time, but there was a lot of people involved in it.
Michael, may I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
I'm just so struck in this discussion, hearing Jim talk about the early history of the thought process behind the building. And it just strikes me that it is such a powerful gesture that reminds me of the Paul Manship Atlas sculpture at Rockefeller Center in New York. And it's this heroic statement about lifting our collective knowledge up off the horizon of Ohio. And I'm just wondering if that was the initial symbolism that Byron Ireland was trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
I couldn't even comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the writing, Steve, there is alignment with that. Whether it's a direct reference to that particular sculpture, but the idea that you're sort of, elevating knowledge was part of his thinking, and it's been pretty well documented now. We have about 2 minutes. Do we have another question or have time for another question?
Hey, Michael, I'll leave it up to you and the panel. We do have a few more questions waiting in the queue, so I will leave that up to you. But for now, since we have a few minutes, I'll go ahead and I'll feed you another one if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay. So the parking lot today is used for farmer markets on certain weekends. Did Byron leave surplus space in the design to be co-opted by the public, like utilizing the surrounding lawn, etc.?
I don't follow the question.
Basically, Jim, the question was, did Byron think about how the open space, like the open green spaces, could be programmed for different functions over time? Or was he just making a statement with that space and not really intending it to be programmed beyond that, or leaving it open to whatever would happen in the future?
Well, I think it was open. I mean, if you take a look, like I said, there's over an acre out there and on that plaza deck. And when, you know, the workers used to sit out there and eat lunch. So it's a space that's open for the people to enjoy the space. And if they don't take advantage of it, that's their issue. When they did the Doughboy, they had to finally move the Doughboy because there was a set of steps that went up there. And it got so overcrowded, they had to move the Doughboy because it was getting so much activity of kids and people wanting to go up and touch the Doughboy. So, you know, that created a lot of problems. The metal that you have on it, the standing seam roof, that was not original. And it was all concrete at one time. And then because of the amount of people that spent time in that open area, the benches are gone that were there where you could sit down and eat lunch. And there was a lot of traffic that would come over from the fairgrounds and come to that building and either walk inside or picnic on the outside. So it was intended to be an open space that was let's say not dedicated to any particular function. It's left to the people's imagination that came to it. However, had they finished the issue to the north, where the village is, I think there would have been a lot more activity because you can't get from the village to the museum. If they'd have put the bridge in, then you would have been able to access from the building through the covered bridge and into the village. Right now, they've made it such an issue. It's a half a day's journey to walk from the building to the village.
Great. Well, thanks for that. So we're at the hour now. I want to respect everyone's time. I suppose this conversation is the kind of conversation that could go on forever if you let us, but we really appreciate all the panelists' contribution today. Great stories, anecdotes from the past, as well as some insight about the future and some, really sensitive thinking. I'd encourage everyone that, hasn't been to the building when it opens up again, take a walk through and think about some of the things that we talked about today and really try to experience it as the architect intended. I mean, there are a lot of thoughtfulness behind this this building and the design of it. And, we want it to be a treasure in Ohio forever. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to the organizers and they can close things out. But thank you all.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, just one question. When are we going to open up the time capsule?
I was waiting for that question, Jim. I'm not touching that one. I'm not touching it.
I've got my hammer and chisel. I'm ready to go.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure. Jim, will definitely open up. You'll definitely be the person doing it. So we hope to do that once we reopen. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Michael, for putting this together and for your masterful moderating. And thank you to all of our guests and visitors who joined us tonight. It's such a pleasure to have this incredible building given the credit that it's due, and we're looking forward to its now being eligible for a registry on the National Register and engaging with that process over the next couple of years. So, it'll be with us hopefully for many decades to come. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
And just to let folks know, when I close the event out, you will be taken to a survey page, and we just like for you guys to take a couple of minutes of your time immediately after the event and just let us know what you thought of this evening's event. And Michael Fouts, did you have anything else?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll just add one more thing. Once again, thank you so much to Michael and all the panelists for doing this amazing program. The last thing I will mention is that if you're looking for more information about the 50th anniversary building, we have a website page dedicated to a nice info drop of a lot of cool things. And if you go to www.ohiohistory osudp.org/50, the number 50, you'll be linked to a page that includes even a video of Peter Korda sharing his story in a 2005 video by WOSU Public Media. So if you're interested in more history, go ahead and check out that page. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Right.